This first slide, in the blue image in the background, is a picture taken from near where I live. I live in Bristol in the west of England, and this is a bridge. It's called the Clifton Suspension Bridge that crosses the Avon Gorge. And when it was built in the 1860s, it was easily the largest suspension bridge in the world, covering that great gorge. At the time, most people said it can't be done. It's impossible. It's way too big a gap. And I just put it up as an example of people being wrong about what's possible. And I think when we talk about the inclusive city, there'll be some people who say we can't build an inclusive city, it's impossible. I like the Clifton Suspension Bridge because it denies that kind of negative thinking. Okay, in this talk I'm going to go through three parts. Talk about our urbanizing world. Secondly, talk about the power of place-based leadership. And thirdly, a little bit about leading innovation in cities. And I'll be drawing on a new book. I have a new book out. It's called Leading the Inclusive City. I have a copy here. I'll leave it at the back if people want to look at it. There are some flyers about it. But in the presentation, all the images are of places that are in the book. This is Portland, Oregon. And I'm not going to talk about that city too much today, but it's probably the most progressive city in the USA, and it is one of the innovation stories in the book. It's very green, but it's also very strong on what Americans called equity planning. In other words, enhancing social and economic justice in the city. But let me just step away from particular examples for a moment, and I wanted to just put some images up early on of beautiful, marvelous cities, because those of us who are involved in urban studies often focus on all the problems and tensions in cities, and this is good. We need to address the challenges. But I just wanted one slide, which is a celebration of the life-enhancing qualities of cities. So we have 8 here. Chicago, which is where I lived in my last job. I was the dean of a college of urban planning and public management in the University of Illinois in Chicago. So Chicago is in the book. Copenhagen, Freiburg, Malmo, Ahmedabad, Hamamatsu, Auckland and Guangzhou. Those are 8 of the 17 cities featured in the book. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to start talking about all these cities. They illuminate an argument, and I'm going to use 1 or 2 examples, but try and give you the key idea of the argument about place-based leadership, because I think that's the bigger takeaway than particular stories, though you may disagree. Okay, just a couple of charts of urban trends. If we look at the percentage of the world population living in cities, it has, as you obviously know, grown considerably. In 1900, it was 13%. Round about 2008, by the way, this is all UN figures on population. Round about 2008, the world went urban, and demographers argue about exactly when. But before a date round about then, most people alive on the planet did not live in cities. After that date, they did. So it's up to 54%, maybe 55% now, and it's set to rise in the future. The UN thinks to about 66% of the population of the planet will be in cities in 2050. My second chart is the actual figures in millions. I think in a way this is more helpful. If we look again at 1900, we have 220 million people living in cities. This grew to 732 million. Then we see the big jump. By 2011, more than half of the population of the world are living in cities. It's 3.6 billion then, against 3.5 billion not. This next one's the key one, I think, for us today. It's going up to 5 billion in 2030, and the forecasts take it on beyond that to 2050, 6.3 billion. For me, the most important point about all this is that jump of 1.4 billion between recently and 2030. This is not long-term forecasting. We are creating an urbanized world very, very fast. This has never happened in human history before. I think that means we've got a fantastic opportunity to create just, sustainable cities, because they're not there yet. So I take a very optimistic view about what these trends mean, because with good leadership, we can create really good cities. Okay, there's two more illustrations of the urban trends here. This one is of the largest cities in the world in 1950. If you just have a look, I'm going to show you another map in a moment of 2025. And it will be drawn to the same scale. Those blue bars are the size of the population of those cities. So in 1950, New York City had about 12.3 million people in it, and it was the largest city in the world in 1950. Tokyo was quite close behind it, about 11.9. Then you can see the other major cities population-wise, and the graph at the bottom gives you the size of the cities. I want you to try and hold that image in your mind, and I'll flip the chart to 2025 and show you the 20 biggest cities in the world in 2025. I think you will notice a bit of a difference. Have a look at Europe. In Russia, there are no megacities in those parts of the world. I mean, we could talk about this map for a long time, but I'll just make 2 or 3 quick points. One is just look at the size of the megacities. The largest city in the world in 2025 will be Tokyo. If you remember, it was second back in 1950. Now it's 38 million projected. 38 million. 10 of these 20 cities are above 20 million. So they're not, a mega city is 10 million. 10 of these are double mega. So we're talking bigger cities. But you will have noticed the location of this urban expansion. It's mainly in the developing world, particularly in China and India. Sometimes I get a bit criticized when I show this slide because in a way it is misleading. Most of that urban expansion that I talked about, the 1.4 billion, will not be in the megacities. I think these are eye-catching. They are enormous cities, unprecedented, and they raise massive challenges for leadership, actually, because they're so big. But most of that growth of 1.4 billion will be in cities under 5 million. So again, that's comforting because we can develop the capacity to lead and manage those cities because they will be a lot smaller than the big ones. So if you're interested in urban studies or city planning and public management, I often talk about these ideas with students. I mean, this is a very lifting presentation so far because the amount of work to do is formidable, so the job opportunities are really great. And I encourage you to think internationally as you look ahead in your careers. Okay, we go to the second part of my presentation now, the power of place-based leadership. That's an aerial view of Bristol, which is where I live. And if you look at the very top of the slide, you will see a small suspension bridge in the distance at the very top. That is the one I showed you at the beginning. That's the Clifton Suspension Bridge. That's the Avon Gorge. And this is the view of the heart of the city. This semicircular building in the middle with the green in front, that is our City Hall, which is the municipal headquarters of Bristol City Government. I can talk, and maybe in questions, or I'll be staying throughout the day, I could talk a bit more about Bristol if people are interested. We have a directly elected mayor. It's a new model of leadership, and we've done detailed research on whether it makes a difference, and the answer is yes, it does, but it also has some limitations. So I'm not a gung-ho advocate of directly elected mayors, but there are some advantages. But I don't really want to talk too much about Bristol. I want to take us on a little bit of a journey further afield, and I'm going to take us to Melbourne. This is one of the innovation stories in the book. I probably should explain. An innovation story is a short, research-based account of an inspirational example of place-based leadership. So all 17 stories are about something inspiring that's been taken place in a particular city. Melbourne is a good one to start with. In 1978, a local journalist wrote an article about Melbourne, and this is from that paper, saying that the city had a, quote, empty, useless city centre. So the journalist did not mince his words, and it was true. What they'd created in Melbourne was a classic era of urban planning in those days, which was a CBD, as the Americans call it, a central business district downtown with all the offices and the federal government, and so, well, the agencies of the federal state. At night, it was totally empty, so it's a hopeless break between the nighttime and daytime economy, and therefore it was actually quite unsafe. So the journalist said our planners lack the courage to bring our cities back to life. So it was in a bad place. In the last 5 years, and we could debate this, The Economist, which evaluates the quality of life in cities around the world, talks about livable cities. Melbourne has been number one, I think, or not, if not number one, in the top 3 every year for the last 5 years. So it's not just become number one in Australia, it's become number one in the world, according to The Economist. So we're talking about a place that was a dump, without a shadow of a doubt, to a place that's now really a world leader in how to create a livable city. How did they do it? The answer is place-based leadership. In fact, the answer for every one of my innovation stories is the same answer. It's place-based leadership. I'll say more what that means in a minute. But key features here were a left-leaning city hall with politicians. We haven't any in the room today, but I credit the politicians with saying we're not having an empty, useless city centre. We're going to put the public realm front of stage in all of our decision-making, particularly in negotiations with developers. So they became very demanding on what was expected. And okay, it's a good location, Melbourne. It's got investors wanting to come there, so it's got some advantages. We have to accept that. But they used the power of place to get what they wanted, not what the developers wanted in terms of just profits. So basically, they transformed the city centre. They created a city design team. Rob Adams is the city design director of Melbourne. He's still there. He's worked there for over 20 years. It comes down to individuals at times, these things. He was given power to lead, and he did lead and is leading. So the centre of the city has been transformed. We've got basically cars out, people in. For Amsterdam, this is going to be fairly familiar territory. But imagine a city that was not like Amsterdam. It was in a bad place. It had to make a lot of change. And they did make a lot of change. From, I think, 200 or 300 people living in the CBD, they've now got 25,000. By the way, they don't call it a CBD. They changed the name in the 1980s to a CAD, a Central Activities District. This is in urban planning jargon, perhaps, but to try and change how you describe a place. So I give it to you just as one example of quite successful civic leadership. And I think it's continuing to be fairly successful, though some critics might say not quite as good as it was. I think that's enough examples. I now want to talk about the concepts that underpin this work, and this part might be most relevant to the field lab discussions we're having today. My argument is that in any place, and you can take Amsterdam if you like, there is a system of place-based governance. The autonomy and power of that governance varies dramatically across space in the world. So in some places, there's a lot of local power, in some there's less. Wherever it is, I argue, the power of the local place is shaped by 4 sets of forces. At the bottom are the environmental limits. So the argument here, and I'm very pleased about the progress made on climate change at the international level. So the Paris conference in December, national government said we've got to do something about climate change at last. And some of you may criticise and say it's not going far enough, but there we've got a step forward towards sustainable cities. And I know in the Netherlands you've been world leaders on this, so I'm not going to labour the point. But unless we have environmentally sound planning of our cities, we're not going to have people living on the planet long term. The planet will be fine, but we won't be. So in this chart, in this diagram, that is the only side of the square that's solid. Can you see the others are dotted lines? They're malleable. They can be moved, but the environmental limits are not. There's no choice. We have to build sustainable cities. What about these other sides? On this side, you've got what I call the economic framing, the economic drivers. When I was in Chicago, I learned quite a lot more about this because in the American context, it's more visible. And there are books over there arguing, the scholars now arguing, that cities need to serve economic interests. That's their only hope in the modern world, the globalized world. They better be very, very, very nice to business. And some cities are very business friendly in the States. You do need to attract business and you do want successful businesses in your place. But my argument is you might not want business at any cost, and some businesses do not actually care about the place. So in the book I distinguished two kinds of decision makers: place-based leaders who care about the place, and placeless leaders who do not care about the place. So in our big multinational organizations, there are very powerful people in our globalized world now, today, making major decisions about places, and they don't actually care about the place. They're not bad people, they're there to make profit for their companies, so that's what they do, and they're pretty good at doing it in some cases. But the point I'm making is they don't care about the place, so they can destroy communities. So the economic drivers need to be contested, and luckily they are in every city. We find on the other side what I call socio-cultural pressures. People who live in cities have ideas about what they want it to be like. They want to take their kids to school safely. They've got all kinds of values that they want to see delivered in their place. So you've got a conflict, naturally, between these social and economic drivers and the cultural drivers. At the top of the diagram, there are arrangements for governing localities. There's laws that the nation state will have arranged for the power of the city of Amsterdam or other cities. In my country, we are in a bad place because our central state has taken power away from local government, weakened it dramatically. So even if you have an elected mayor in Bristol, as we now do, their power to do things is quite low. In other cities like Chicago, and I don't know enough about the Netherlands, it varies by country, the powers of local government can be quite strong. In my experience, Sweden has probably got the strongest system of local government in the world. It's enormously powerful in terms of fiscal power, and not surprisingly, voter turnout's pretty good in Sweden as well. So the governmental framing shapes what the local leaders can do. But the thing I want to bring out in this diagram is you can expand the power of place. That's how we created local government. If you go back 150 years, we didn't have local government anywhere, really. We created it and we grew the power of place to govern place with elected assemblies making decisions. So there's a nice story about local government improving things over the years, but maybe a bit under threat in some countries. So that's the overall framework. There's just two parts to this model. The second part is what I call the realms of leadership. And you know, I was talking earlier, asking you to put your hands up. I'm suggesting there are 5 realms of leadership in any place. There are elected politicians, as a rule, who've got the legitimacy lead because they've been voted for. On the left there, you've got what I call the public managerial professional leadership. Many of you raised your hands and said you were in that group. Sometimes public servants do not see themselves as local leaders, and I quite enjoy provoking them and saying, just a minute, think of your skills and knowledge and what you bring to your work. You are a leader as much as anyone else on this diagram, and the creative local authority gets the politicians and the public servants working together in a very imaginative way in that innovation zone. The grey areas on this chart are what I call innovation zones. That's areas where people come together from different backgrounds and try and learn from each other and create new possibilities. And I think this is what field labs try to do. I'm going to learn more this afternoon when we go out. But I think we're in these, I call them innovation zones. You might call them field labs. So that's the state. You've got the two parts of the state, the elected and the appointed, but there are three other realms of leadership in this diagram. And each one is admittedly a big realm, but allow me just to give the simple presentation. You've got the business leadership down here. Local businesses and sometimes international businesses that do care about the place. And in US cities, you'll find a business club is a very influential part of the governance of the city. And that can be very productive because they bring energy and resources to the governance of the place. Also, though, you have trade union members. And again, depending on the city, the trade union voice can be very significant in how the place is governed. On the right, I admit this is a bit of a catch-all. I've got this community leadership, which is all those activists who care about the place and are active in it. They might be special interest groups, they might be religious organisations. I actually put universities in the community realm in this diagram because we're not part of the state, we're independent, and perhaps in some places, and maybe your university here is a good example of wanting to exercise leadership in the city. So what's the key point in the diagram? The areas of overlap are what matters. I call them innovation zones. Sometimes people put their hands up at this point and say, Robin, this isn't really what they are. In my city, we have these realms. Those shaded areas are not innovation zones, they're conflict zones. They're massive battlegrounds where people from different backgrounds are fighting each other. Have you seen the way the politicians are imposing views on the communities and the way the communities are protesting? My answer to that is absolutely right. Yes, they are conflict zones. Conflict's endemic in the city, and the art of inspirational leadership is to take ideas from the conflict to create something new that the different parties couldn't have created on their own. It's very simple to say, really hard to do, but that's the argument. And it's happening. I've got 17 examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think there's some really good examples to look at. That diagram unites the previous two. So we've got the 5 realms, they're sitting in this space that's constrained, or maybe it can be expanded. And again, just to skip through this, I think, this is the same diagram. Incidentally, this presentation is going to be on the web after the event if people want to go through it and look at it more closely. That's the same diagram. Environmental limits are solid, there's no choice. But have a look at the agency exercised by the locality. It's influenced by governmental, social, cultural and economic forces. New innovations can be developed, new practices created, and you've got a kind of, I quite like the idea of a learning city where there's discovery process and movement going forward, hopefully. Okay, that's a conceptual frame. I hope I haven't gone through it too quickly. I want to give you one more example now. We're jumping across the Atlantic to New York City. This is an elevated railway. It's disused, by the way, running down the east side of Manhattan. If you go back in American history, as you know, major port, New York City, the railhead, all the goods went out, not on the roads, because we didn't have the big highways back in the day. A lot of it went on this railway out to Chicago and the rest of the continent. Enormously important, but became, in the 70s really, relatively disused because they built the massive US highway network, as you know. In 1980, it actually became disused. So you've got this structure, about 2-story high, right through Manhattan, dilapidated and neglected. Think of the property values in Manhattan. Just for a moment. This is probably one of the most expensive real estate areas in the world. The developers were dying to get this out of the way and build development and do good things, but maybe make some money. So they lobbied City Hall. Mayor Giuliani, who was the Republican mayor of New York. I don't want to be too biased today, but he is a supporter of Donald Trump, so that might be enough for you to get where he's coming from. He was the mayor, and he approved the demolition of the railway. That line goes through 2 gay neighborhoods in Manhattan. And the story in the book of the saving of the High Line is a story of community activism, but particularly by 2 gay guys, Joshua David and Roger Hammond. They're not urban designers, they're not politicians, they're just guys living in the neighbourhood, which was what they liked doing, and they liked this structure. It said something about the history of the city. It's quite a romantic place in those days, I think, a bit, you know, a bit of kind of unruly space that no one's quite governing. So it was a quirky thing, and they thought, why demolish this? It's part of our history. We want to do something about it. So again, you have a story of complete disaster to fantastic success. Now, the High Line, because of the Friends of the High Line, has been saved completely. Well, the bottom end was taken out before this group started, the very bottom. But now you've got, I think it's 35 blocks of a linear park threading its way through Manhattan. It's a public space. This is not privatized space. This is public space with outstanding access for wheelchair users throughout. And they've got good designers in to help create something really rather special in a very compact urban area. So the local community, it's a longer story here, but the local community campaigners said this is so important. I have to say 9/11, it didn't do many good things, that attack on New York City and elsewhere, but it had a big shock effect on New York City, and the campaigners were able to use the emotional feelings about being under attack to make the case for we don't want more destruction in our city, we want to value what we've got, we want to grow something. So the timing might have been helpful to the campaigners. One or two councillors could see the possibilities, so the political realm connected. Mayor Bloomberg gets elected. He reverses the decision. It had been a demolition order. He reverses Giuliani's decision. And they create this linear park in the sky. If you go to New York City, it's absolutely fabulous. I would recommend it. There's lots of other great things to see in that city. But this park is something special. They're a bit worried now, a bit like Amsterdam, that they might have too many visitors. So last year, they had 6 million visitors. I don't know what the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art in New York has, but it might be less than the High Line. 6 million. It's a creative space. I like it. I think in New York City, was the first time I went on it, I'd never seen so many people in New York City holding hands. And I think this could be an indicator of urban success. If people, you know, you're holding the little kids walking along, romantic couples, a little bit of contact like that, on there you do get it. And in New York, which is very driven, that's quite unusual. It's not quiet, it's in the urban environment, the city is still there, but it is sort of peaceful. Notice that this innovation story was not City Hall that led the change. In the realms of leadership, the first one, Melbourne, was City Hall should get credit. This was the community realm, the community activists. But I want to give credit to City Hall, because what was good about City Hall is they listened to the community and said, we have got a fantastic resource here, we should do something with it. And then the planners and the lawyers, there was a lot of really clever technical work to rearrange the values that lay under the land to create urban development. Now, adjacent to the High Line, some developers are doing some really nice development and quite successful and are making money. So it's one, I think it's a win-win-win-win. There's almost nobody losing in that particular example. Okay, I'm going into the last part of what I want to say now about leading innovation. It's probably just 2 or 3 more examples to throw into the mix for us to think about. This is Guangzhou. If you remember in that slide of the 20 biggest cities in the world in 2025, well, Guangzhou is one of those. It's down in the south of China, and the population now, nobody quite knows, because in China the migrant movement is such that a lot of people are off the books, but I think it's probably around 15 million people living there now. And I did a little bit of work with them, this is 2 or 3 years ago, and I was quite struck by the way they're involved in international learning. This is the main reason I've got it in this presentation. What they found was with the growing middle classes in China and the growth in car ownership, the whole city was getting totally jammed, and you'll have heard the stories, they're in the news quite regularly, about congestion in Chinese cities and air pollution problems. So the leaders of Guangzhou were thinking, we've got a problem with congestion. Where in the world has anyone done anything radical about that? And they discovered that it was Latin America. So if you go back, it's actually Curitiba in Brazil that was the first city to introduce what's called a bus rapid transit system. I better explain what that is. We haven't got that in Europe anywhere, so people might find it a bit difficult. What on earth is that? This one in Guangzhou is the largest BRT in Asia, and the reason they've introduced it is because of the congestion, but the idea is from Latin America, particularly Bogota. Bogota's got the most developed. So the idea is you take road space off private motorists big time. So you've already got a congested city. This needs leadership, trust me. They're already annoyed that it's so congested, and you say, by the way, motorists, you're having less road space. Actually, you're going to have a lot less because we want that space to have these rapid bus lanes. And that's a picture of the BRT. If you think of a subway, I think of London Underground, but you've got metros. A really good subway can deliver 25,000 people per hour one way in a rush hour. That's high performance metro. The BRTs in Bogota, but also here, can deliver the same number of people per hour in one direction, 25,000. Here's the killer. The cost of a BRT is 1/10 the cost of a metro. So if you're a developing country and you've got those urban challenges that we mentioned, and you're thinking, we haven't got the resources to build metros and we need to do something radical, you redistribute the public space and you make a major step forward. Now, to be fair, they are building a metro in Guangzhou as well. They are a very prosperous city now and they can see they need a metro. But I quite like the idea of the South-South learning, because often we in the West think we've got a lot of good ideas, and actually we have. European cities have got great leadership on urban planning and design. But we've also got, some learning that we can make by looking at other parts of the world. So that was the Guangzhou one. Also, I wanted to have a big city, because some of these projects, actually this is a good one, are very microscopic. Guangzhou, 15 million. This is a part of an informal settlement on the edge of Langrug in South Africa. This is 1,500 shack dwellers living on the edge of a city, on the edge of Stellenbosch. It's not a great photograph, that, but I've got it in this presentation because this is University of Cape Town urban planning students working with residents to reshape the shacks to make it a more livable place. You know those earlier slides, and I talked about the 1.4 billion of growth, the massive expansion. A lot of that growth will be informal settlements on the edges of big cities in the developing world. There are already 1 billion people living in informal settlements now, and it's growing. So maybe if we can get more creative, and universities have helped here, how do we design this place so it's better than it would have been? And the key in this is called taps and toilets. That's the strategy. You need to address those basic needs with a toilet block and also water supply that's clean. But then the story is a nice one of how the residents then actually created a hair salon. It was the women. The women are often the key drivers in real innovation in local places, and it is the case here. They create a hair salon. You think, what do you mean, a hair salon? Well, a hair salon then became a community development focus for this community on the edge of Stellenbosch. It got the prize for the Town Planning Institute in South Africa for the best piece of community development, I think in 2011, I think it was. So I've come down to a very local example. I've got one more, then I'm going to stop and we can open it up. This is closer to home, but and I think, to be fair, this could easily have been a city in the Netherlands, actually. This is Freiburg in Germany. Do we have some German students in the room today? We've got some friends from Germany. Could you raise your hands? We've got some German visitors. Oh, not so many. I thought might be one or two more. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I've got to be careful now talking about Freiburg, right? I think it is a fantastic city. And again, you've got this story. If you go back to 1970, when it wasn't really, it was like pretty much any of the cities in southern Germany. But it made massive steps forward with place-based leadership, actually. But if you think about the emergence of the Green Party, that's where the Green Party started. You can have an argument, but I'm pretty clear it was in 1970 in Freiburg because of resistance to a proposed nuclear power station. This is Vauban on the south side of Germany, and I like it because the little kids on bikes kind of rule the neighborhood. It's so safe. You can take your cars into these spaces, but the dominance, this is a classic Dutch model, isn't it? The dominance is not the car, it's the people living there. And it's a great example. The public transport's outstanding, and from having no bike paths in 1970, it's now got 300 miles. And it's a population of 220,000, Freiburg. It's not a massive city. It's like they've got the network in. And they're growing it with very high quality urban design and high standards of planning. So I think that's impressive. Again, it's place-based leadership. It is the directly elected mayor of Freiburg is from the Green Party, but it's also the public servants. Wolf Dasseking has recently retired as the city planner for Freiburg after over 20 years, and made a major contribution with others, but also the university is very active in the city. You've got this bringing together of the realms of leadership. That's all my slides. I want to just close now by maybe making 3 or 4 closing remarks. The first thing is, I hope I've convinced you, maybe you didn't need convinced, I hope you can see there are claims that can be made about place-based leadership. Sometimes people feel this globalized world is such that we can't control anything, these forces are beyond our reach. That's not true. There are thousands of cities around the world, and this is just a few, taking advantage of place-based power to do things. The second thing is, I think there's something here about realms of leadership being brought together, that the city hall that wants to go it alone, it might be kind of admirably brave, but it's not going to work in our modern interconnected world. Leadership has to be leadership, I call it leadership across boundaries, and it involves risk-taking. This is the third point, in those innovation zones, and this might be the most important for the field labs, actually. In those spaces, people are taking risks. They're going to try out things that might not work, but that's part of what you do to be an effective leader. And you join together and agree to take risks and learn from them. So the experimental city is very much a part of this whole presentation. And I think the last thing I'd like to say is that there are benefits in international exchange. I think we can learn a lot from each other within our own countries, but because other countries maybe have a very different way of seeing things or operating or practices, it can be quite stimulating to see, oh, they do it that way, that's completely different from how we think. Maybe we don't want to do what they do, but there's some insights that we can actually gain from each other. So I'm a great believer in international learning. Thank you very much.